Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Events Series. It has been a long time since we last had an in-person event. It is great to see you here in this nice auditorium, but also to almost see people online on Zoom, because this is a hybrid event. We are live streaming this event to a large online audience, and we have an in-person event here in the Mandela Auditorium at UNC-Chapel Hill. Hello to everyone. It's great to be back with the Krasno Global Events Series. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at UNC-Chapel Hill. I've been organizing the events since 2012, and we are still going strong. As you know, the Krasno Event Series at UNC always deals with issues of great global concern. We have online people from China today, and in China it's quite early. Then we have plenty of people from Berlin in Germany, and from the UK, from Liverpool, from London, from Belfast in Northern Ireland, and also from Tbilisi in Georgia in Central Europe, and from many other places around the world. Welcome to all of you, and of course, welcome to you in this auditorium here. Tonight, we have a very exciting event with a very insightful speaker. We will be talking about 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan after 20 years, how it happened and how it changed almost everything. We are still shocked by the chaotic and terrible events of the last few weeks, when the US finally decided to withdraw from Afghanistan. Our speaker, Samuel Walker, will first talk about the events of 9/11 and then deal with the Afghanistan war and its end. It is a tremendous pleasure to welcome Sam Walker to Chapel Hill. Sam is a very distinguished historian who has written many books on most interesting topics. He is a former historian of the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission based in Washington, DC. And he received his PhD from the University of Maryland. Sam's most well-known book is entitled Prompt and Utter Destruction: Truman and the Use of the Atomic Bombs Against Japan. It was published by our own UNC press, and it is now in its third or fourth edition. Sam's latest book is The Day That Shook America, A Concise History of 9/11, University of Kansas Press, September 2021. It has just come off the press, and it's so fresh off the press that the publisher hasn't managed to send us copies of the book. Even the author hasn't yet seen the book, but it is available in all good bookstores and from Amazon from Monday onwards. I know you will all be rushing out to buy the book on Monday. Thank you very much. Sam has obtained many honors and prizes and has been extremely prolific. He has written many articles, and he has also given an awful lot of lectures, and many of them were public lectures. Among his many other books are 3 Mile Island, A Nuclear Crisis in Historical Perspective, The Washington, D.C. Riots of 1968, and Henry Wallace and US Foreign Policy. And he has written 2 books on college basketball. One is entitled The Road to Madness. Sam told me that he is a keen golf player, so I guess he may soon write about the global impact of golf. Today, of course, Sam will talk about more serious matters, 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan. But let me first remind you that we have a great website that is krasnoevents.com, and we have a popular YouTube channel, youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. And as you know, we videotape all our events, and they can be found on our YouTube channel within a week or so. So please watch our events as often as you possibly can. And please sign up to our mailing list. If you're watching online, you can do that via the website or by just sending me an email. If you're here in this auditorium and you still are not on the mailing list, just come and talk to me and my assistants, and we will be happy to include you on the mailing list. Tonight, Sam will give his presentation first, then I will interrogate him a little, and ask them a few, hopefully hard questions for 20 minutes or so. And then we open it up to questions from you, the audience. People in the auditorium, please raise your hands, and two of our Krasno assistants will come with mics and ask you to pose your question. People online on Zoom, please submit your question, as always, by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Two of our excellent Krasno assistants, today Anna Fiore and Pete Velasmil, will select the questions and read them out aloud for the speaker to answer. There are usually so many interesting and provocative questions. Unfortunately, we cannot answer them all, but we will do our best. Please mention your name and your location when asking or writing down a question. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you back to the Krasno Events Series at UNC-Chapel Hill. Tonight, we will talk about 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan 20 years later. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Dr. J. Samuel Walker.
Thank you, Klaus, and thank you for your warm reception. It's a great pleasure to be in Chapel Hill, and it's a great honor to be a part of the Krasno Lecture Series. I must say that I made numerous trips here to Chapel Hill when I was doing research on a couple of books on ACC basketball, and it's always a pleasure to be back. I must say that as a graduate of the University of Maryland, which used to be a member of the ACC, and as a brother of a former player at the University of Virginia, it's a relief for me to see that most of you are not decked out in Carolina blue tonight. I'm not sure about those of our audience who are online, but those of you who are live, I'm glad to see, appear to be neutral. Well, I want to talk about one of the most important events in our history, the attacks of 9/11, the terrorist attacks against the United States on September 11, 2001, rank among the most important and most tragic events in all of American history. The human costs of the 9/11 strikes were staggering. About 3,000 people lost their lives. The count that we now have, which seems to be the best we can do, and is accurate, is 2,977. There were passengers and crews on the 4 hijacked airliners, employees and visitors at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, first responders, and bystanders who were killed directly or indirectly by the collapse of the Twin Towers. The death toll was higher than at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, which was about 2,400, and the greatest loss of life in a single day on American soil from hostile action since the Battle of Antietam in 1862. In that battle, about 3,500 Union and Confederate soldiers lost their lives. Those who died on 9/11 were not soldiers or sailors, but ordinary citizens who were going about their daily business when they inadvertently became victims of Al-Qaeda's crusade against America. And that is one reason that the 9/11 attacks were so sorrowful and so devastating. Among those who lost their lives that day were the members of a family from my hometown of University Park, Maryland, which is a small and fairly close-knit community right outside of Washington. Charlie Falkenberg, his wife Leslie Whittington, and their daughter Zoe, who was 8, and Dana, who was 3, were on their way to Australia when they boarded a plane at Dulles Airport, Flight 77, that very soon crashed into the Pentagon. They were on their way for what was going to be a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. Leslie was an associate dean and professor at Georgetown University. She had a 2-month fellowship in Australia. The whole family was going. They were looking forward to it. The girls were anxious to see koalas and kangaroos. It was going to be a wonderful family experience, a wonderful family adventure, once-in-a-lifetime adventure that turned into a tragedy. I did not know the family personally, so I found out later that they lived just 2 blocks from me. But their story, I think, highlights the tragedy and the heartbreak of what happened on that day. And that is one reason that I wrote my book, because I hope it will serve as something of a tribute to my neighbors and to all those who perished on 9/11 at the hands of the terrorists. The process of writing this book for me was often a troubling and intense voyage of discovery. There is still much that we do not know yet about 9/11, but I think it is essential to reflect on what we do know and to try to answer a host of questions about why the attacks on American citizens and American landmarks were so shockingly successful. The fundamental questions that I try to answer are: what did responsible government agencies and officials know about Al-Qaeda before 9/11? Why did they not do more to head off the threat that it posed? What did Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush do to combat the dangers of terrorism? And why did they fall so far short of defending the country against a series of attacks on 9/11? And perhaps most importantly, and most difficult to answer, in fact, impossible to answer conclusively, was the tragedy of 9/11 preventable? And these questions boil down to a single mystery. How did the strongest nation in the world, which spent hundreds of billions of dollars on defense and intelligence, allow a small motley crew of 19 terrorists to hijack 4 airliners, destroy iconic American structures, and claim the lives of nearly 3,000 people? Bill Clinton entered the White House in January of 1993 with little knowledge or interest in foreign policy in general, or terrorism in particular. But it soon became clear that terrorism in the United States was an immensely troubling problem that he would have to deal with. By the latter half of the 1990s, it was also clear that the most serious threat was the Islamist militant Osama bin Laden and his terrorist network called Al-Qaeda. What was far less clear was what could be done and what should be done to fight and to try to end the threat that bin Laden posed to American interests and to American lives. The US intelligence community had been aware of bin Laden since the early 1990s. At first, intelligence agencies viewed him as a so-called Gucci terrorist, that is, a wealthy financier of terrorism who was not otherwise personally involved. But this view gradually gave way to recognition that bin Laden was much more than that. This assessment was grievously confirmed in August of 1998 when Al-Qaeda suicide attackers exploded truck bombs at the American embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The strikes were enormously destructive, especially in Nairobi, where they killed 213 people, including 12 Americans, and injured 4,500. And this indicated that Al-Qaeda was even more of a dangerous enemy than US intelligence had previously believed. So Clinton faced a big problem for which there was no obvious solution. He commented that, quote, bin Laden was like fictional villains in James Bond movies because he was a transnational presence, suspended above allegiance to any government with enormous private wealth and a network of operatives in many countries, including ours. Unfortunately, of course, Clinton didn't have James Bond to send to Afghanistan with high-tech weapons to take care of the problem. Clinton and his advisors deliberated at length over ways to deal with the Al-Qaeda threat without arriving at any firm conclusions. They considered several options that were available to them. The problem was that none of the options was very good. One option that was considered, at least for a short time, and considered at some length by the CIA, was to kidnap bin Laden and bring him to the United States for trial on charges of murder and terrorism. The CIA drew up an elaborate plan. Bin Laden often visited a camp that was close to Kandahar, and it had about 80 buildings, and it was surrounded by mud walls 10 feet high. And the plan that the CIA came up with was to hire 30 Afghans to sneak into the camp, to find out which building bin Laden was in, to kidnap him, to carry him out of the camp, to carry him to a cave, and eventually turn him over to the CIA. The CIA knew that the chances of success for this plan were not great. They put it at best at about 40-60, and other senior officials and policymakers were even less impressed. One called it a half-assed plan. So it was dropped without ever going to the president for consideration. A second possible approach was to fire cruise missiles at al-Qaeda camps in hopes of killing bin Laden and his top lieutenants. Clinton had done this after the embassy bombings, but the results had been acutely disappointing. The success of this method depended on accurate and up-to-the-minute intelligence, and this was often extremely difficult or impossible to obtain. Furthermore, Pentagon officials did not view the camps as, quote, high-value targets. In fact, they called the camps in Afghanistan jungle gym camps that were not worth the cost of launching dozens of cruise missiles at a cost of about $750,000 apiece. They also worried that if the missiles missed their targets again, as they had after the embassy bombings, it would give bin Laden increased stature, make him even more of a hero among his followers, and enhance recruitment for the al-Qaeda network. Another military option was even less promising, and that was to send troops into Afghanistan. President Clinton told General Hugh Shelton, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that he thought it would, quote, scare the shit out of the al-Qaeda guys if we sent US commandos, ninja guys in black suits jumping out of helicopters into camps, spraying machine guns. Shelton, who was a former commander of US Special Forces, which would have to carry out such an operation, grimaced and explained that you couldn't send in commandos without good intelligence, logistical support, and a nearby base of operation, none of which were available in Afghanistan. Asked what would be needed to mount a full-scale invasion, Shelton estimated that it would take tens of thousands of troops and massive air and ground support. There was no appetite for this kind of operation within the Clinton administration, certainly not in Congress, and certainly not among the American public. So in the absence of viable military options, the Clinton White House attempted diplomatic solutions, but these were not fruitful and probably never had a chance to succeed. The State Department carried on a long list of discussions or frequent discussions with the Taliban. And the deal that they hoped to arrange was that in return for diplomatic recognition and perhaps aid to rebuild the country, because Afghanistan was destroyed in the war against the Soviets in the 1980s. So in return for recognition and assistance, the Taliban would turn over bin Laden to the United States for trial. The Taliban refused, in part because bin Laden, who was enormously wealthy, was provided much needed financial assistance to the Taliban. But even more importantly, he was providing weapons and battle-hardened soldiers. And these were important to the Taliban because it was still fighting to gain control of all of Afghanistan. Furthermore, the leader of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, shared a deep-seated belief with bin Laden in the Islamic faith and a vision of its triumph over its enemies. So the Taliban were not at all receptive to diplomatic attempts by the United States to turn over bin Laden. The US also tried to convince Pakistan to put pressure on the Taliban to turn over bin Laden. But again, this was fruitless, largely because the primary goal for Pakistan was to have a friendly government on its long border with Afghanistan. The Taliban were mostly in control of the country, and Pakistan, in fact, was aiding the Taliban, so they were not at all inclined to respond favorably to US appeals to pressure the Taliban to turn over bin Laden. The final option was to greatly increase US support for groups in Afghanistan that opposed the Taliban and its efforts to control the entire country. There were several armed groups, armed militias of varying size that continued to fight the Taliban in Afghanistan. The most prominent was the so-called Northern Alliance, which occupied large sections of northern Afghanistan under its leader, Ahmad Shah Massoud. Massoud was a gifted and charismatic leader. He was a hero of the Afghan war against the Soviets during the 1980s, and he needed increased assistance from the United States, especially food, medicine, and cash to pay his soldiers. he could potentially offer much in the way of badly needed intelligence information about Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, and perhaps, though this was a long shot, perhaps even assist in the capture of bin Laden. But there were strong doubts in Washington that providing aid to Massoud was a good investment, partly because of a fear of rekindling the Afghan civil war and destabilizing the entire region, partly because of reservations about his reliability, and partly because of evidence that some of his forces had participated in mass rapes and murders. For those reasons, the Clinton administration hesitated to deliver greatly increased aid to Massoud. In the end, the Clinton White House did not follow through on any of these options, and this was true even after Al-Qaeda suicide bombers attacked an American destroyer, the USS Cole, in the harbor of Aden, Yemen in October of 2000. The explosion caused massive damage to the ship, killed 17 sailors, and wounded 39 others. But it took a while to establish beyond doubt that Al-Qaeda was responsible, and ultimately nothing was done. Clinton's refusal to act was in part the result of not having good options, and in part a reluctance to impose a policy on the incoming Bush administration. And this had the effect of confirming bin Laden's belief that America was weak, helpless, and decadent. During a transition period, Clinton and his top advisors emphasized the magnitude of the threat from Al-Qaeda that they perceived. Clinton told Bush that on national security issues, quote, by far your biggest threat is bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. The CIA told Bush and Vice President-elect Cheney that Al-Qaeda was, quote, a tremendous threat that was immediate. Bush and his top advisors were not much impressed. They regarded terrorism as an important issue, but not one that demanded urgent attention. Bush later commented that he did not feel, quote, a sense of urgency about bin Laden and that, quote, his blood was not boiling. Further, he and his national security team thought that Clinton's approach to Al-Qaeda was weak and ineffective. Therefore, they were not inclined to take the advice or the warnings from the Clinton White House all that seriously. They were more concerned about other issues, including Iraq, Iran, North Korea, and the need to build an anti-ballistic missile system that would protect the United States from those rogue nations and perhaps Russia and China. The Bush White House's rather casual attitude toward the Al-Qaeda problem soon led to differences among officials in the National Security Council. Richard Clark was a high-level NSC staff member who held the title of National Coordinator for Counterterrorism. He was smart, blunt, outspoken, and in some minds obnoxious, and he made no secret of having his, quote, hair on fire about Al-Qaeda. On January 25th, 2001, 5 days after Bush took office, he sent a strongly worded memo to his new boss, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. Clark argued that, quote, we urgently need to make decisions on what to do about Al-Qaeda. And he attached a paper that Clinton's NSC had prepared in December of 2000 as they were preparing to leave office, and which Clark had a major part in drafting, that was largely a summary of the options that the Clinton administration had considered. And Clark was appealing for a prompt decision on what the Bush White House wanted to do. Rice did not share Clark's sense of urgency. Rather than making prompt decisions, she favored formulating what she called a comprehensive plan for dealing with the threat, even if this approach required more time than the immediate action that Clark was calling for. She regarded Clinton's approach to counterterrorism as, quote, feckless, and she wanted to come up with something that was better. And so over the spring and summer of 2001, the Bush administration held meetings, traded memos, and reviewed drafts of a comprehensive plan. They did so at a rather leisurely pace, even in the face of an alarming series of intelligence reports that indicated that Al-Qaeda was planning a, quote, spectacular attack, or perhaps multiple attacks on American interests abroad, and perhaps in the continental United States. couple of examples of these reports. A headline of an intelligence report on June 23rd, 2001, quote, "Bin Laden attacks may be imminent." On June 30th, Bin Laden planning high-profile attacks that he hoped would produce, quote, "dramatic consequences and major casualties." A couple of weeks later, CIA Director George Tenet received a compilation of reports from his staff that he said later literally made my hair stand on end. He was so alarmed that he went to see Rice at the White House immediately. He had never done that before. He had seen Rice on many occasions at the White House, but he had never done it on a spur of the moment. He had never jumped in a car with a couple of staff members and went to see her at the White House. And he told her that the intelligence that the CIA had strongly indicated that Al-Qaeda planned to hit American targets, perhaps in the continental United States. Rice listened politely, but she said that she believed, quote, "we are doing what needed to be done." One major problem with the intelligence that was available was that it provided few, if any, clues about when or where the attacks might take place. The burden of evidence pointed to an overseas strike, and the Bush administration took a number of important steps to improve defenses in American installations abroad. It strengthened security at embassies. It closed down the embassy in Aden. It issued warnings to Americans abroad, and it worked with foreign intelligence agencies to try to track down terrorists or to get information on terrorist plots. What it did not do was to do anything to significantly strengthen defenses in the United States, in the homeland, against a possible attack in the continental United States. On August the 6th, the CIA provided a briefing to President Bush. The briefing paper carried an ominous title, quote, "Bin Laden determined to strike in US." This briefing paper created a great deal of controversy when it was made public in 2005 because it looked like a smoking gun that showed that Bush knew the 9/11 attack was coming. But it was not all that clear, and it was hardly a smoking gun. It provided a chilling overview of bin Laden's abundance of statements since 1997 that he wanted to conduct terrorist assaults against the United States. But the paper offered little, if anything, that was new, and Bush did not see it as something that required immediate action. He was reassured by the report's notation that the FBI was conducting about 70 field investigations on matters relating to bin Laden. So it is clear that Bush and his advisors received a great deal of intelligence information from the CIA and other agencies about a looming threat from Al-Qaeda. But it is also clear, we found out within a short time after 9/11, that intelligence agencies missed warning signs that could have led to the revelation of important information and perhaps even foiled the plot. The most egregious failure was failing to track the activities or figure out the intentions of two Al-Qaeda operatives who lived in this country for about 20 months before 9/11. These two men had sworn their personal allegiance to bin Laden. They were affiliated with Al-Qaeda. They had attended a meeting of Al-Qaeda operatives in Malaysia, and then they had traveled to the United States. And the CIA knew all this. They came here in January of 2000, about 20 months before 9/11, and they lived here until September of 2001. When they joined the attacks, they were among the hijackers who hijacked the plane that crashed into the Pentagon. But the CIA knew that they had come here and then dropped the ball. The CIA did not make any effort to pass this information along to the FBI, which would be responsible for figuring out what these people were doing here. It wasn't until May of 2001, after they'd been here for about 15 months, that a CIA staff member who was working on an investigation of the bombing of the USS Cole said, hey, these guys came here and we don't know where they are. So he passed this information along to the FBI. The FBI sat on it for a couple months. Finally, in August of 2001, this is a month or so before 9/11, the FBI decided, well, maybe we should launch an investigation, find out what these guys are doing, find out what their intentions are, what they're doing here, what their connection to Al-Qaeda is, what in the world they are planning to do, and shouldn't we try to figure out who they are and what they're up to. But unfortunately, the FBI, after they decided that maybe this was worthy of an investigation, had an internal dispute over who within the FBI should conduct the investigation. So no investigation was undertaken before 9/11. If the FBI had decided to undertake an investigation promptly, it would not have been hard to find these two men. They were living openly in San Diego. They purchased a car. They had driver's licenses. They opened bank accounts under their own names. One of them had his name in the phone book. And they also had taken flying lessons. Flying lessons didn't go well. But the point is that these men would not have been hard to find and to track down and at least question to try to figure out what they were doing, what their intentions were, and to find out more information. So in retrospect, the failure to track the activities of these two men and perhaps find out more about their ties to Al-Qaeda was a major lost opportunity. More timely scrutiny might have exposed the 9/11 plot, or at least called attention to the threat of terrorist attacks coming from within the United States. Meanwhile, the NSC was working at a measured but not urgent pace on the presidential statement on combating Al-Qaeda. The statement was called a National Security Presidential Directive, NSPD. And an NSPD is a big deal within the government because it's a statement signed by the president, approved by the president, signed by the president, and it says to whomever it is addressed to, in this case, the national security establishment, this is something I think is important and you need to do something about it. But progress on drafting the NSPD was slow, even in the face of the dire warnings that intelligence agencies were receiving about the threat and providing to the White House. After a series of meetings, discussions, drafts, and redrafts, a finalized version of the NSPD was approved by the NSC, which is a final step before it went to the president. And this occurred on September the 4th, 2001, 1 week before 9/11. So after 8 months of deliberation over the comprehensive plan that Rice and others had claimed would be a big improvement over Clinton's efforts, the final version of the NSPD was very similar to the options paper that Clark had provided to Rice back in January. It called for increased aid to the Northern Alliance and other anti-Taliban groups in Afghanistan. It called for more diplomatic pressure on the Taliban. It's not clear what the Bush people thought they could do that Clinton hadn't done. When Rice was asked about this sometime after 9/11, she said, well, we thought that tough talking might make a difference, as though Clinton and his people had not done that. The NSPD also called for enhanced covert action against Al-Qaeda, which Clinton had already started, called for budget increases for counterterrorism, which again, Clinton had already started. It proposed a phased application of this plan over a period of 3 years or so, and as a last resort, direct military intervention by the United States. The NSPD offered no novel suggestions on how to carry out these actions or how they would succeed where earlier efforts had failed. In short, the Bush administration came up with a comprehensive plan that was little different than what Clinton's NSC had drafted and outlined without formal adoption 8 months before. Richard Armitage, who was a deputy Secretary of State and known for his bluntness, later said, quote, there was stunning continuity in the approaches of the Clinton and Bush plans. Another senior official who participated in the deliberations commented, quote, "I have a real difficult time pointing to anything from January 20th to September 10th that can be said to be a Bush initiative or something that wouldn't have happened anyway." The final version of the NSPD landed on Bush's desk for review and signature on September the 10th, 2001. And I don't need to tell you what happened the next day. So how did the world's strongest nation by far allow a group of 19 terrorists to pull off a daring and devastating attack on the American homeland? In the aftermath of 9/11, the intelligence community received a great deal of blame, and there certainly were major flaws in the performance of intelligence agencies, and I've just talked about one, perhaps the most flagrant. And yet, in other ways, the CIA and others did their job. They collected enormous troves of information on bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and passed along stark warnings of an immediate danger to American lives to policymakers. The disaster of 9/11 was fundamentally a policy-making failure that was due in part, as the 9/11 Commission pointed out in its report in 2004, to a shortage of imagination. Neither the Clinton or the Bush administration seriously considered the risk of suicide strikes on national monuments with hijacked commercial airliners, and certainly not attacks that were so well planned and executed involving multiple hijackers with the motivation and ability to convert planes into weapons of mass destruction by flying them into buildings. But the problem went far beyond a deficiency in imagining the kind of attack that occurred on 9/11. It was an error or a series of errors of monumental dimensions on the part of Bush and his advisors. The Clinton administration issued multiple stark warnings to Bush and his top advisors about the severity and the immediacy of the threat that Al-Qaeda posed to the United States. It also, drawing on its extensive deliberations and unhappy experiences, presented a list of carefully considered options to its successors. But Bush and other officials regarded Clinton's campaign against Al-Qaeda as weak and even squeamish. They dismissed the proposals they received in favor of undertaking what they viewed as a fresh and comprehensive review, which took them 8 months to formulate. The cost of their contemptuous dismissal of the lessons the previous administration had learned and their delays in agreeing on a strategy of their own cannot be calculated, but they could well have been very high. As Condoleezza Rice wrote in her memoirs, quote, "I did everything I could. I was convinced of that intellectually. But given the severity of what happened, I clearly hadn't done enough." Her heartfelt admission applied equally to her colleagues in the senior leadership of the Bush White House. Which brings us to the obvious and unanswerable question: could the tragedy of 9/11 have been prevented with more timely decisions and actions? And I realize that I'm diving deep into the realm of the counterfactual here, but I think the question needs to be addressed. It can't be answered conclusively, but I think we need to address it. On this issue, there was rare agreement between Condoleezza Rice and Richard Clarke, a former staff member and later sharp critic. Both said no, the attack could not have been prevented. Rice, because the plot was well underway by the spring and summer of 2001, and anything Bush would have done wouldn't have prevented the attack. Clarke said no, it was not preventable because even if the 9/11 plot had been foiled, Al-Qaeda would have done something just as bad or even worse at a later time. And yet the troubling and to me haunting thought remains. What if the NSPD that went to Bush on September 10th had been issued earlier? A presidential directive commands a great deal of attention and power and authority within the government. And I can't help but wonder what might have happened if it had been agreed upon much more promptly. Perhaps the CIA and the FBI would have made more of an effort to recognize that you had two Al-Qaeda guys living in San Diego who had sworn personal allegiance to bin Laden and tried to figure out what they were doing there. Perhaps the FBI would have paid more attention to the presence of potential terrorists who were living in the United States. On 9/11, the FBI had a list of potential terrorists living in the US, and it was just a handful. 11 days after 9/11, on September 22nd, the director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, handed Bush a revised list that had 331 names of potential terrorists living in the United States. And Bush said later he was floored by that number. No one had any idea, and the FBI had not done a good job of figuring that out before 9/11. Richard Clarke held a meeting on July the 5th, 2001, with high-level officials of several agencies to warn them about the Al-Qaeda threat and the possibility that Al-Qaeda might try to, quote, hit the homeland. Clarke was very forceful, but the results of his warnings were almost nil, at least among agencies responsible for domestic security. And agencies that were responsible for protecting the homeland from within or abroad really didn't know what to do. I mean, they listened, they heard what he said, but they didn't do anything effective. And perhaps the power of an NSPD that was issued earlier would have brought about some effective actions. Perhaps the Federal Aviation Administration would have taken steps to tighten boarding procedures before 9/11. The FBI ordered its field offices to be ready to investigate a terrorist attack if it occurred, but it did not instruct them to do anything to keep an attack from occurring. The 9/11 plot was not so foolproof that it could not have been halted with greater anticipation and modest defensive measures. And this is all speculation, and I'm keenly aware of that. But it is clear to me that the long delay in finalizing the NSPD on a danger that was abundantly clear to top officials in the government was unwarranted and at least potentially very costly. It might not have made a difference, but it might possibly, we can't be sure, have spared America the agony of 9/11. Well, I know I promised in my title to explain how 9/11 changed everything, but I've changed everything about my title. What I'm going to do is talk briefly about what has happened since 9/11 in Afghanistan and try to bring us up to where we are right now. In the wake of 9/11, the Bush administration had three basic goals. One was to avoid blame as much as possible. A second, much more important, was to try to improve domestic security. And the Bush administration took a number of important steps in this regard. One of them, and I'll just mention one, but one of them was to make a rule that you couldn't carry a knife of any length on an airplane. On 9/11, you were allowed to carry a knife onto an airplane if the blade was no longer than 4 inches. And that's exactly what the terrorists did who hijacked the 4 planes on 9/11. They had knives that were with blades that were less than 4 inches, and they were perfectly legal. They had box cutters, and that's what they used to murder pilots and flight attendants and to take control of the cockpits of those 4 planes. So one action that was taken immediately was to change that rule. Unfortunately, it was too late. The third goal was to successfully prosecute a war against Al-Qaeda. And this, of course, was the beginning of the war on terrorism. The first phase in this war was to go after Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And within a short time after 9/11, we had started to do that. In late September 2001, about 3 weeks after 9/11, a small team of CIA operatives dropped into northern Afghanistan at great personal risk. They linked up with members of the Northern Alliance and other anti-Taliban groups. They passed out large amounts of cash, which was good for securing loyalty. They were shortly thereafter joined by other small groups of CIA operatives. And by early October, the US had undertaken a major bombing campaign, both with cruise missiles and with bombers. And the bombers were guided in large part by the information that the anti-Taliban groups and the CIA people and special forces, there are about 300 members of special forces, US special forces in Afghanistan by October. And the bombing campaign was extremely effective. And meanwhile, the Northern Alliance and other anti-Taliban groups were taking on arms against the Taliban with remarkable and surprising success. By early December of 2001, that is about 3 or 4 months after 9/11, the Taliban were on the run. They were losing their cities. They were losing control of the country. They had abandoned Kabul. They had abandoned Kandahar, which was the center of their operations, and the war appeared to be won. So within 3 or 4 months, it appeared as though victory was ours. President Bush thought it was a great bargain. We'd pass out to anti-Taliban groups and others who were fighting, well, to those who were fighting the Taliban, about $70 million in cash, and that seemed like a great bargain. The war appeared to be won without a great loss of American life. But the apparent victory also raised a serious question. Now what do we do? The answer was not obvious, and in fact, this fundamental issue has never really been resolved. One course of action would have been to declare a victory, pack up, and go home. This would also, this would almost certainly have meant that the Taliban would return to power, and with the Taliban, the resurgence of Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden was still alive, and his forces, although weakened and in hiding, were still a force to be reckoned with. And so the option of simply declaring victory and going home was not seriously entertained. The only other reasonable course of action was to underwrite the development of a stable, effective government that would win popular support in Afghanistan and keep the Taliban from taking over the country again. And Bush even talked about creating democratic institutions in Afghanistan. And this objective, of course, was never accomplished. So the dilemma has been for the past 2 decades, do we abandon Afghanistan and take the chance that it would once again become a breeding ground for terrorism? Or do we continue to prop up what became a weak, corrupt, and ineffective government with no end in sight? And soon became clear that keeping the Taliban under control and building a viable and respected government in Afghanistan was a bridge too far for the United States and its NATO allies. To make a virtually impossible job even more difficult was that the Bush administration tried to accomplish this goal on the cheap. To achieve its goals, what it needed to do was to establish a professional army and professional police forces that could defend the country and support a stable government in Afghanistan. And this required a lot of money. But Bush and his advisors did not want to invest money or resources in doing this because they thought the war in Afghanistan was won. And furthermore, by mid-2002, they were focused on what they regarded as an even greater threat, and that was Saddam Hussein's Iraq. We invaded Iraq in March of 2003, and by that time, Afghanistan was an afterthought. And the result was not surprisingly, conditions in Afghanistan quickly deteriorated. By 2006, the Taliban had reemerged as a major threat to the government in Afghanistan and to the US and NATO troops who were stationed there. The Taliban made steady gains in southern and eastern sections of Afghanistan, and as a result, by 2007, In spite of themselves, the Bush administration had about 50,000 US and NATO troops trying to stem the Taliban tide. When President Obama took office in 2009, he wanted to get out of Afghanistan. He decided that the only realistic path to doing this was to send more troops to fight the Taliban. The surge that he authorized brought the US force levels up to more than about 100,000, with NATO troops about 150,000. And while combating the Taliban with this surge in troops, Obama hoped to build an effective Afghan army and police force, which was still not present, who would take over the job of protecting the country and promoting an effective government in Kabul. The alternative was unacceptable. As Obama argued, quote, if the Afghan government falls to the Taliban, that country will again be a base for terrorists who want to kill as many of our people as possible. And that's the main reason we didn't leave Afghanistan then or earlier or later, was fear. Fear that instability in Afghanistan, or worse, the Taliban takeover, was going to allow the resurgence of Al-Qaeda or other terrorist forces, and that was simply not an outcome that was acceptable. And so we continued to do what we could without succeeding. And Obama undercut his own goals by announcing that the surge would last only for a specified time, which meant that the Taliban only had to wait it out. Donald Trump came to office with a pledge to end America's forever wars. He was the first president to enter negotiations with the Taliban, which might have been a good thing, except that Trump undercut his own negotiating position by starting to take out troops. There were about 18,000. He lowered the number to 8,000, made clear that he wanted to get the rest of them out as quickly as he possibly could, because his motivation was he thought it would help him to win re-election in 2020. So the deal that he made with the Taliban in early 2020 was a fig leaf that said the US would withdraw in about a year after the election, if the Taliban promised that they would not allow Afghanistan to become a breeding ground for terrorists. But there were no means of enforcement of the Taliban's pledge. Trump said, quote, if bad things happen, we'll go back with a force like no one's ever seen. It's not clear what he meant by that, but given Trump's track record, it almost certainly was bluster. We can be sure, given Trump's track record, that it was not based on his own personal review of the history of our involvement in Afghanistan and the dilemmas it created. So that was a situation when Biden came to office, and he decided to carry out what Trump had started by ending our mission in Afghanistan once and for all. And it is, if you read the paper, you know that it is not at all clear what the outcome of this will be. Will Afghanistan again become a safe haven for terrorists who want to attack the United States and murder American citizens? And at this point, there's simply no way of knowing. History is not a guide in this respect. We can hope, however, that the United States will have learned something from the events that led to 9/11 about the need for extensive and accurate intelligence, timely consideration of options, and if necessary, carefully planned and targeted military action. We can also hope that the Taliban will have learned something and refuse to allow terrorists to thrive in their midst. They presumably will not need the weapons and soldiers that bin Laden once provided. And perhaps this time they will decide that it is in their interest to play a responsible role in international affairs. So we can hope for the best. And there are some indications that things might work out okay. We don't know. But we also must prepare for the worst. And in doing that, we must be ever mindful of the errors and failures that allowed the tragedies of 9/11 to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thanks very much for, let me get the microphone here. Maybe I give you that. That is better.
I get that. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you very much for a very interesting and insightful talk. You told us an awful lot about the details of 9/11. And when I interpret your speech correctly, the incompetence of the Bush administration. And you told us about the developments since then. Let me ask you, do you think withdrawing from Afghanistan was the right thing to do after 20 years? Should it have happened much earlier, or should the United States have continued?
You know, do I need this?
Yeah.
Okay. You know, that's a really good question. And looking at my watch, I see we're almost out of time. So yeah, that's an excellent question. And there are no sure answers. I'm not sure there are any good answers. Should we have gotten out earlier? Yeah, probably. But then you wonder when was the right time to get out? Before a few weeks ago. Probably it would have been possible to have gotten out not too long after we defeated the Taliban in 2001. And one thing we might have done, which was never considered, was to have the Taliban be a part of coalition government and give them some input, some authority in a coalition government that might have been able to make Afghanistan into a viable government. But that was never going to happen. There was too much bitterness, too much anger toward the Taliban. The other time that might have been a good time to get out would have been after bin Laden was assassinated in 2011. Al-Qaeda was in shambles, which is not to say there weren't other groups, but Al-Qaeda was on the run. It was weak, and it needed the leadership that had been decimated even before bin Laden's death. So there might have been an opportunity there, but it all comes back to what happens if we leave. And everyone was mindful of what had happened before 9/11, where we knew that a threat existed but didn't do anything effective about it. And that could happen again. And so we have to make certain that doesn't happen again. And what that did was to lead us into supporting a government that was not effective, was not popular, and did not was not competent to deal with the problems in Afghanistan, which were and are huge. So were we right to get out? Yeah, I think at some point, I think we were. The way we got out, the mechanism has been terribly tragic and unfortunate. But I think the decision was the right one.
Mm-hmm. And what about the withdrawal? Something, as you said, went terribly wrong. Could that have easily been avoided, or how do you say that?
Well, it was based on intelligence that said we would have 3 to 6 months to withdraw. So if that had been true, then the planning that was done and the assumptions that were made would have been valid, and we could have gotten out much more gracefully than we did. But those plans went by the boards when the president of Afghanistan fled. I mean, the Taliban were making gains much faster than anyone anticipated. But any hope to protect Kabul and any thoughts of having a well-planned and well-executed exit went by the boards.
Well, but they closed Bagram air base in early July, I believe. And why was that done? Doesn't one first get the civilians out and then the military rather than the other way around?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I simply don't know the answer. I mean, there's lots of questions. There are going to be good books written about this. And obviously it was not well planned. And I don't know if the assumptions were wrong or if they simply got taken so much by surprise that they hadn't planned for what happened. But it has not been a pretty picture.
Thank you. You said in your talk, quite rightly, I think, that the Iraq war distracted from Afghanistan. So would you think, on your reading and your research, if the Iraq war had never happened, so there was no invasion of Iraq, American resources and attention could have continued to focus on Afghanistan, that would have made a difference to bring Afghanistan into, more into the modern world than it happened?
Possibly. I mean, and I'm not sure about the time frames here, the dates on which these things happen, but when a question came up, when it was obvious to Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld that we were going to have to do something to build a government and to build a military and to build a professional police force of some kind in Afghanistan, and they said, okay, we can do that, and they allocated, I think, $1.5 billion for the Army and 2.5 for the police force, something like that. Well, what was needed was more like 7 billion or 8 billion. And that's a big difference. And people went to Rumsfeld especially and said, we need more money. If we're going to do what we said we're going to do in Afghanistan, if we're going to do what we need to do to end the threat of another 9/11, we need more money. And Rumsfeld said, don't talk to me. I don't want to hear about that. Because the assumption was things in Afghanistan were under control. We'd won that war. And now we have this guy in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, who we think has weapons of mass destruction, or could. And so we need to focus on him. So yeah, more resources earlier might have made a difference. Certainly the trillions of dollars we spent in Iraq was wasted.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to think so.
Yeah, when we go back to the beginning of your talk and the run up to 9/11, you basically, if I understand you correctly, were not impressed by the performance of the Bush administration. Would you say it really was the president himself, or which of his advisors were really the ones who perhaps gave him wrong advice, who really miscalculated?
I think it started with Bush. He wasn't the only one, and what he thought was reinforced by his advisors, especially Cheney and Rumsfeld. But Bush said later for one of Bob Woodward's books, and I quoted him, and that's where the quotes came from. But he said it looks like another case of high-tech America that's too weak to do anything right. We look weak, we look feckless, we look ineffective. And that's how the Bush administration viewed what Clinton had done. And they didn't give Clinton much credit for what he had done. Clinton did more to combat terrorism than any previous president. Terrorism was not a new problem in the 1990s. It became much more acute in the 1990s, and Clinton did a lot. It turned out it wasn't enough, but at least he recognized the problem. He talked about the problem in many speeches. He greatly jacked up the amount that was spent on counterterrorism, and so he did a lot. It wasn't enough, but he did a whole lot more than he got credit from Bush. And the Bush people just kind of were full of contempt toward Clinton. So they didn't take seriously what Clinton had learned or what he had done. And I think that started with Bush, and I think that was true of his advisors as well. And I think it was terribly unfortunate. I mean, America, the Bush administration was certainly warned. There was no lack of information that Al-Qaeda was a threat. What there was a lack of information about was where the threat was going to be carried out. And that was a big surprise. But the fact that Al-Qaeda was a menace to our society was well known.
Would you be able to pinpoint anyone in particular who you believe was more at fault for ignoring evidence, for giving the wrong advice, or not really? Is that impossible to do? Was it, Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, Cheney, Colin Powell, whoever, Richard Clarke, whoever?
Yes.
All of them.
No, there were different views. Colin Powell was quite skeptical of a lot of what Bush and Cheney and others. There was a group. There's a book. It's a good book. It's called The Vulcans. And the Vulcans were conservatives who were convinced, number one, that America could do no wrong, that America should have this by far the strongest military in the world, so that no one could challenge it. Two, that the president should have practically unlimited powers in conducting foreign policy. And three, that we shouldn't, that's four, isn't it? I knew that, I was just checking on you people. And four, that international agreements and international cooperation was something we didn't need. It wasn't important to us, and it dragged us into things that we didn't need to get into. So there were these kinds of assumptions and these kinds of philosophies that really controlled to a large extent how we responded to the threat of Al-Qaeda.
Thank you. A lot of people argue that Afghanistan, despite all the mistakes made, despite all the tragic end right now and the chaos and the sacrifice of many of America's partners and friends who still are and probably will never be able to get out, still the effort was worth America's while, because there was not a second 9/11 that was avoided, perhaps prevented. Would you agree with that? Was that really the outcome of a carefully designed policy, or was it sheer luck so far?
Yeah, I agree that the reason we went into Afghanistan was to prevent another attack, another 9/11 type terrorist attack again, and that we succeeded. Was that a result of a plan? One of many problems about our policies and our activities in Afghanistan is that we never really had a strategy. I mean, we didn't have a plan. The plan was to get rid of the Taliban. Plan was to get rid of Al-Qaeda. And after we did that, then what's our plan? How do we define a victory? When can we get out? Because everybody wanted to get out. It's just they didn't know how they could do that, and the fear factor was always predominant. If we get out, is that going to mean that we are subjecting ourselves to another 9/11 type terrorist attack? And no one could ever say no. Biden is saying no now because our intelligence is much better, and we're keeping tabs on terrorism in Somalia and Yemen and other places where the threat is very real. But we never quite figured out what our goals were and how we were going to determine when our goals had been accomplished.
Last question. I know you don't like to speculate, but I would like to invite you to speculate and tell us what you think the future will be. Will it be a relatively stable Afghanistan as far as, at least as the Western world is concerned, or will it go back to being a terrorist haven? What about the whole region and the influence of Russia and China by that sudden, abrupt, and very chaotic withdrawal?
I see we're almost out of time again. Yeah, we don't know, of course. And one problem with dealing with the Taliban, and we always refer to the Taliban, is that there are lots of Talibans, and the Taliban in Kabul is not necessarily the Taliban in Kandahar or the Taliban in Western Afghanistan or the Taliban in Northern Afghanistan. And the Taliban is still, in important ways, a lot of warlords, a lot of provincial chiefs. And it's not clear to me, I don't think it's clear to anybody, what's going to happen if they're going to cooperate with the government, if they're going to listen to and obey the government in Kabul. And so that's one problem. The other thing, and it's a more optimistic assessment, is that the Taliban appear to have learned some lessons. They did cooperate with us on the evacuation, and they did so in a way that probably saved American lives and lives of others who were getting out. The big question is, and the great thing to worry about is what happens to those Afghans who were left behind, who supported and cooperated with America for 20 years. And that's going to be, I think, the telltale sign. If those people are not harmed, if they're not killed, if they're welcomed back into society, if their contributions to Afghan society are appreciated, then I think there's real hope that Afghanistan can survive and become a part of the international community. But that's open to question.
You seem to be quite an optimist. That's as good.
Well,
that's a good thing too.
Well, we'll see. There's no way of knowing, but there's at least reason for hope. I don't think I'm terribly optimistic, but I think there's reasons to be at least hopeful.
Let's hope you're right. Thank you very much.
Well, I hope
Let's
so
open
too.
it up to questions from the. Let's open it up to questions from the audience. People here, please raise your hands, and online, please submit your questions by the Q&A function. This gentleman up there, please. Yeah, there's a microphone coming. Could you? And yeah, there's a microphone coming. And please say your name and where you're from or your affiliation, anything like that.
Hello. My name's Taylor. I'm from Henderson, North Carolina. I was just wondering if, in terms of building a government in Afghanistan, was there any consideration of returning to a monarchy? Because I have a vague knowledge of Afghan history, not very much, but I know there was at least what seemed to be a stable monarchy in the 20th century. So I didn't know if that was a consideration. I think the king was still alive or something like that.
Thank you. Over to you.
Yeah, and I don't know a lot about that, and I'm certainly no expert on the history of Afghanistan. But yeah, at one point, the former king came back and he was going to be a candidate. He was going to run as a candidate against Karzai. And Karzai wasn't happy about that, and that was sidestepped somehow. The former king was convinced not to run as a candidate for president. So there was some consideration, but I mean, the plan was to make Afghanistan into a democratic government. It was a hopeless plan, but Karzai showed some promise, and there was hope that, well, maybe we can build an effective government. Nation building, maybe nation building, we can do it on the cheap. And I don't think there was any serious consideration about returning to a monarchy. There was some serious consideration of having the monarch as president, an elected president.
Thank you. By the way, I met Karzai at some conference in China a couple of years ago, and I asked him to be one of our Krasno speakers. And he was quite interested in doing that. So maybe we can get him in the future when he is less busy than he probably is right now. Any more questions, please? This person there, right at the end. Yeah, please. In the black pullover, I think.
Hi, I'm Greer. My question is just, what role do you think American interventionism has played in the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East? Like specifically thinking about like the Operation Cyclone, like with the CIA during the Soviet-Afghan War, and how do we rectify the problems caused by that without further intervention?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question.
What role do you think American interventionism has played in the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East? Specifically thinking about like the role the CIA played during the Soviet-Afghan War during the 1970s under the Reagan administration.
So are you asking, has or have the work of American intelligence organization made the problem worse in the Middle East, in Afghanistan? And we know that, you know, the Mujahideen were supported by the CIA and the United States when they were fighting the Soviet Union. And that, of course, gave the Mujahideen modern weapons and gave them the experience they then used against America itself.
Yeah, I think so, partly. It certainly did give them experience and weapons and things that allowed them to, one, defeat the Soviets, and that was our aim, and then turn around and treat us as the enemy. But the other side of that is the Soviets left lots of stuff behind, so it wasn't all American stuff that they were using against us. So yeah, I'd say yes, there was a role. It was a fairly small role. It's not as though we were supporting bin Laden or other people who turned against us in significant ways.
Okay, thank you. Do we have an online question?
Yes, we have a few. So both Scott Schwartz and Brian Killef would like to know if George W. Bush had consulted George H.W. Bush, his father, and adopted a nuclear strategy and foreign policy strategy more similar to his father's. Do you think he would have faced more success?
Let me see if I understand the question. Would George H.W. Bush have done what George W. Bush did in Afghanistan?
Did he ask his father for some advice when he went into Afghanistan, possibly Iraq, or did he ignore his father's advice?
In Kuwait and Iraq.
Yeah, he asked his advice, but I haven't read all the books about George W. Bush, but there was some sort of a father-son tension there with George W. trying to prove he was his own man and not just a son of an ex-president. And I'm sure that he talked to his father about Afghanistan. I don't know what his father told him, but George W. Bush was much more inclined to listen, especially in his first term, much more inclined to listen to the Vulcans because they seemed to have the answers, and they seemed to be such a big improvement over Clinton and his weak-kneed people as they viewed the Clinton advisors and Clinton himself. George H.W. Bush had a much more complete and much more subtle understanding of international relations than George W. Bush did. And George W. Bush was much more dependent on his advisors on diplomatic issues and military issues than George W. Bush was.
Thank you. Do we have another online question?
Yes, we do. Someone else is asking.
Can I ask you, when asking the question, perhaps to do it
Yeah.
without the mask and then put the mask back on?
That would help.
Michael Hopkins is asking, has Biden simplified the options open to him by creating this dichotomy between only complete withdrawal or a massive continued military presence in Afghanistan, or if there was some sort of middle ground that would have helped the Afghans increase their military presence, but of course limit ours?
Was it an either or was there a middle ground that Biden could have followed?
Yes.
Is that the question? Okay. Well, by the time Biden came to office, we were down to 2,500 soldiers in Afghanistan, which wasn't enough to do much of anything. Even when there were 150,000 American soldiers and NATO soldiers in Afghanistan. There wasn't enough to stymie the Taliban. It also wasn't enough to really know what was going on in the kind of hinterlands of Afghanistan. And keep in mind that Afghanistan is mostly hinterland. So was there a middle ground where we stayed with maybe 20,000 troops or 50,000 troops? We had tried that, and it hadn't worked. And in important ways, I think after we're past the immediate problems and the immediate crisis and the immediate tragedies, Bush will be seen as having made, not Bush, Biden will be seen as having made the right decision in Afghanistan. It was time to get out. We'd done what we could do for 20 years and there wasn't much else we could do. So I don't see any viable middle ground between leaving and having, some number of troops here, because the troops weren't going to be enough to defeat the Taliban or to make Afghanistan into a viable
But
government.
did the American military not actually recommend to Biden to keep 2,500 troops plus NATO troops in Afghanistan and continue the mission at a reduced way?
I don't know if they did or not. I simply don't know.
Okay, thank you. Can we have some more questions from the audience here? The lady in the bluish t-shirt here. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Sheridan. I'm from Hendersonville, North Carolina, and I'm a junior here at UNC. You mentioned earlier how early on in the Afghanistan war, a few months after 9/11, when the Taliban were fleeing Kabul and Kandahar, that was considered a victory by some. I guess my question is, we went to Afghanistan for al-Qaeda because they were the ones who attacked us. So how did the Taliban become the enemy that we became focused on defeating?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In fact, Obama asked that question a lot when he was president. He said, well, why are we fighting the Taliban, excuse me. He said, how many Afghans hijacked airplanes on 9/11? What role did the Taliban have in 9/11? The Taliban didn't even know the 9/11 attacks were coming. It's not as though they were involved in the planning or the execution of the 9/11 plot. So the question is, why do we fight the Taliban? And there's never been a good answer to that question, except it comes down to, well, if we don't fight them and they take over the government of Afghanistan, then that's going to increase the chances that al-Qaeda is going to come back, and they're going to welcome them back, and they're going to be a threat to America.
Thank you. David Litt over there.
Thank you. David Litt, a retired Foreign Service officer and graduate of Carolina in 1971. Hey. One of the actors in all of this that tends to get a pass in the discussions, a really important, significant actor, is Pakistan, for a variety of different reasons. Your background, as I understand it, is also in nuclear policy. So I'm wondering, has your research shown any deference on the part of the administration to Pakistan because of its fears on the nuclear side, and giving Pakistan a sort of a pass on all of the help that he gave to the Taliban and others?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, we knew that Pakistan was providing all kinds of assistance, not only to the Taliban, but also to al-Qaeda. And most of the al-Qaeda operatives, keep using that word, I don't know what the proper term is, but most of the al-Qaeda people who fled in 2001 fled to Pakistan. And bin Laden was there for 10 years. But the problem was, if we lean too hard on Pakistan, you're going to destabilize Pakistan, and then you might have terrorists or others who take over Pakistan and they have nuclear weapons. So yeah, there was always a great deal of concern and a great deal of uneasiness that we can't do too much to Pakistan. We can't take strong action, whatever that might have been, to protest or to take action against the aid that Pakistan is providing to the Taliban and to Al Qaeda, because we might lose Pakistan that way.
Thank you. Do we have two more online questions, please?
Yes. What do you think are the long-term foreign policy implications for the United States? Do you think that this withdrawal will impact our international reputation?
What do I think of the long-term
Implications for the
of
United States
leaving?
reputation after the withdrawal,
Oh,
chaotic fashion that it did?
yeah,
The question was, maybe I repeat it, what were the long-term implications for American foreign policy caused by that withdrawal from Afghanistan?
yeah, and I think the question addresses a question of its standing and its prestige. We're still the only superpower. I'm sure our allies are concerned. I'm sure they're worried. I'm sure they would have liked to seen a withdrawal that was carried out in a better and a more graceful way. But we're still out there by ourselves, and you know, we survived an embarrassing defeat in Vietnam, where the withdrawal was at least as chaotic as it has been in Afghanistan. So this whole idea that we're losing prestige or we're losing credibility and other countries won't, you know, respect us, I think that's vastly exaggerated.
Thank you. Do we have another online question?
Yes, there's one more. Do you think that the new Northern Alliance in the Panjshir Valley has a chance at retaking Afghanistan from the Taliban?
Do I think there's a chance that we could have taken Afghanistan from the Taliban?
No, the Northern Alliance, right?
Oh, the
now.
Northern Alliance. Well, they did that pretty much in 2001. So we have to be careful not to idealize the Northern Alliance too much. I mean, they had their share of outlaws and thugs and bad people. Massoud, their leader, was assassinated on September the 9th by Al Qaeda guys posing as reporters. And the timing was probably intentional, though we didn't know that at the time. But losing Massoud was a big blow to the future of Afghanistan, I think. So would the Northern Alliance have been an improvement over the Taliban? Yeah, probably. Would they be so now? I don't know. I don't know what there's forces still fighting where the Northern Alliance was once dominant in northern and western Afghanistan. And I don't know what their chances are, but they're led by the son of Massoud. Is that going to be something better if they continue the civil war in Afghanistan? There's no way of knowing. And there's no way of knowing what their chances of success are. I mean, I think we have to live with the Taliban and hope that they will act responsibly.
Thank you. Any more questions? This gentleman and then this lady, yeah?
Stephen from UNC student here. Given the previous question about Pakistan, your response, what kind of implications do you think that has for Iran?
I don't know. How's that for an answer? South Asian politics and Middle Eastern politics is so interdependent and so complicated and can go in so many different ways. I don't know. you know, if Iran gets the atomic bomb, is that going to change things for us? It could. It's not a prospect to be welcomed. But there's there's no telling that I can see how that's going to affect developments in either South Asia or the Middle East. Israel has had the atomic bomb since the 1950s. And in some ways, Iraq's attempts to have an atomic weapon and Iran's are a response to a threat that they perceive from Israel. So I don't know. I don't know if Iranian possession of an atomic bomb would change our policies, soften our policies, or not.
Thank you. Jean, you have a question? Yeah.
Yes, why did the terrorists attack us on 9/11? Other historians have said, like Chalmers Johnson, blowback for our imperial behavior. Benjamin Barber, jihad versus world, sort of the same line. Stephen Kinzer's Overthrow, the history of our regime changes. It's like starting with Mossadegh, the democratically elected president of Iran, to help the British keep control of the oil there.
What is your question, sir?
Resentment. Why did the terrorists attack? I'm saying other historians have pointed out
A
that
resentment,
it was
blowback.
resentment against American imperial behavior.
Would you agree with that? That America provoked the attack on it itself by its behavior abroad?
Well, clearly bin Laden and his legions believed that. Clearly, they believed that America was an imperial nation and Israel was an imperial nation, and that they were a threat to his vision of a new caliphate in which Islamist forces would control the Middle East, parts of Africa, parts of Asia, just like they did back in the caliphate years of 700 to 1200. So, you know, I don't have any sympathy for the view that you know, 9/11 was some sort of an attack in response to American sins or American imperialism. There's other ways to address that, and sending planes into buildings and killing children does not appear to me to be a very appropriate way to deal with grievances.
Okay, thank you very much. We have some online questions. Anna, can you read it to us?
Yes, we have two more questions, one from Rita Yankovic and one from me. The first from Rita Yankovic. Some in the British press are referring to the withdrawal from Afghanistan as America's Suez moment. Do you agree? Is this a fair consideration?
I'm sorry, read that again. I'm having trouble.
Sure. So some in the British press are referring to the withdrawal from Afghanistan as America's Suez moment, as in the Suez Canal. Is this fair?
And they probably refer to the disgust of many of America's allies about the way the withdrawal has been handled and by the lack of cooperation between the United States and the European allies in that course of withdrawal.
Yeah, in terms of it being America's Suez crisis, the Suez crisis was kind of the end of the last gasp of the British Empire. We're not there yet, for better or for worse. So I don't see it having that kind of effect. I think that Europe had much higher hopes for Biden than have been realized so far. But in terms of this being a turning point in world history, or a turning point in American foreign policy, or a turning point in American European relations or G7 relations, I just don't see that happening. I think there's going to be a lot of grumbling. I think there's going to be some sharp words toward America, and maybe Biden will hear some sharp criticism when he talks to other leaders of the G7 nations, for example. But in terms of a turning point, the end of American influence, I just don't see that. But then I'm a historian, so I need to answer questions about history.
Thank you.
Maybe some questions on the history of ACC basketball.
We had another online question. Yeah.
It wasn't actually online, it was my own question.
Okay.
And I was just curious, what role do you think that the war on drugs played or interacted with the like wide expanses of opium poppies and opium farming in Afghanistan? How do you think these two events interacted? And how do you think that impacted our foreign policy in Afghanistan?
You know, the ACC was established in 1953. You know, that's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. We do know that poppy production increased greatly after the Taliban took over, in part because it's a wonderful cash crop that grows in Afghanistan. What effect the war on drugs under Reagan and Bush, first Bush, had on our Afghan policy? I don't think very much, and I've never looked into this, so I'm speculating. I've done a lot of speculating tonight, but we were serious about the war on drugs, but I don't think it was a major impact on our foreign policy. And Afghanistan just wasn't a big issue. To the extent that Afghanistan was an issue before 9/11, or at least before the late 1990s, it was an issue as it related to India and Pakistan, because the focus of our concerns, the focus of our policy was always trying to cool things down between India and Pakistan.
Do you think after 9/11, once 9/11 had happened, do you think there was a chance by any American government to avoid invading Afghanistan? Or was it seriously being contemplated? Of course, there was a feeling of revenge, retaliation, outrage. It is perfectly clear what the view of the country, the emotions of the country were. But of course, we elect policymakers not to be emotional, not to follow public opinion, but perhaps to think more rational than the rest of us. Was that rationality ever a part of the Bush administration thinking about the possible terrible consequences of invading Afghanistan?
In one sense, yes. After 9/11, the Bush administration issued a ultimatum to the Taliban saying, turn over bin Laden or we're going to invade. And the Taliban thought about it. The representative body, the parliament or the council of the Taliban voted in favor of turning over bin Laden, and Mullah Omar vetoed it. And so there was a period of 3 weeks or so, not much time, but time enough, if the Taliban had been so inclined, that maybe we could have defeated Al-Qaeda, maybe we could have gotten hold of bin Laden and not declared war on the Taliban. I mean, it comes back to the question of why did we fight the Taliban in the first place? And the reason was because they had provided safe haven to bin Laden. And they were warned about that. They were warned about that prior to 9/11 numerous times, and these numerous contacts between State Department officials and Taliban officials. The Taliban was told, listen, if this guy does something to our country, we're going to hold you responsible. And so they were well warned about that, but they had their own priorities, and they had a chance after 9/11 and declined it. And other than that, I think there was no chance that there wouldn't be an invasion of Afghanistan. And there was great reluctance because there were no illusions that this was going to be an easy campaign. And that's why the surprise was so great in December of 2001 when the Taliban were driven out. And then that left open the question, okay, now what do we do? And we never answered that question until now. And what we have now is a big mess.
And Osama bin Laden was almost caught in the mountains of Tora Bora, as we all know, but he just about escaped. Do you know the circumstances? Was he simply being lucky or particularly skillful, or the United States particularly unlucky or particularly unskillful? What were the circumstances?
Bin Laden and his supporters knew the mountains because they had lived there for a long time. There was a major campaign that was planned and mounted to find him in the mountains, and it wasn't successful. And some have speculated that, well, yeah, if we had made more of an effort, maybe we could have headed it off. I think the only way to have stopped that, and he was lucky, but he was also, he knew what he was doing, and it was extraordinarily difficult for our forces to find him, number one, or to carry on fighting or campaigns in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. So I think the only way to have gotten bin Laden, short of the Taliban deciding to turn him over, if they could, was to go after Pakistan. And that, for the reasons we've discussed, didn't seem like a very good idea.
Thank you. We have a chance for a couple of more questions and also online, and then we're running out of time. Did you raise your hand? Did you raise your hand? Yes. Can we have a microphone here?
Yeah, so at one point, I'm Nick and I'm a UNC senior from Southport, North Carolina. So I keep hearing two primary narratives from Biden, and that is that we weren't there for nation building, one, and two, that what happened in Afghanistan happened faster than anyone could have predicted, and that his entire chiefs of staff and military advisors were in complete agreement that this policy was the best policy forward, and the way the withdrawal was done was the best way it could have been done. Do you think that this presentation of facts is accurate, or do you think it's misleading?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we don't know about whether there were other proposals, other ideas. We don't know if there were dissenters. At least I don't know. Oftentimes, after a policy fails, we hear about those who advised otherwise, and we might well do that again. But it's easy to condemn with 20/20 hindsight, and so I don't know the answer to your question. It's a good question, and as more comes out, it will be interesting to see what the various options or what the different views were, who was recommending what, and if it was different than what we ultimately did. And yet, when you look at the big picture of what we've done in Afghanistan for 20 years, I just can't imagine there were other good options. And we talked about Biden's claim that, well, it was either this or a huge military commitment. And was there a middle ground? Yeah, but we tried the middle ground. So it all comes back to that. And Biden had been recommending getting out when he was vice president. So he was really carrying through one on Trump's policy, but also on his own views that had been that he had voiced 10 years before.
So was Biden lucky that Trump concluded the treaty, which otherwise he would have had to conclude himself?
I don't know if he's lucky. Trump supporters seem to have forgotten it was his treaty. So I don't know if he was lucky, but I think he would have done it
All right, thank you.
otherwise.
There were some couple of more questions. This lady in the blue t-shirt, yeah.
Just had one more question. Do you think that the military-industrial complex has prolonged our involvement in the war in Afghanistan?
You know, possibly. I don't know the answer. It's a good question. I think they might have prolonged the war in Iraq, where the commitment was much larger. I don't know that Afghanistan was a big deal for arms providers. Obviously, you know, all those weapons that the Taliban now have were produced by American manufacturers. So it was something of an issue, but I don't know. But as far as I know, which isn't very much, there was no pressure coming from arms manufacturers to prolong the war in Afghanistan because they were making great profits. And I don't know how much influence they have. They have a great deal of influence in what weapon systems are built. And they have a great deal of influence in advising that, well, we need this weapon system, or we need this airplane, or we need this helicopter, or we need this type of equipment. And here's why, and here's how much it's going to cost. That's where their influence comes in. And I'm not sure how much influence they have in the actual conduct of the military,
Thank you.
of wars.
There was one final question up there, and then I will ask whether there are any online questions left. Yeah.
I'm Sophie. I'm a UNC student from Chapel Hill. And I was curious if you could expand on the relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda.
That's a question which we all would like to know more about. You know, what precisely is the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban? Do we actually know precisely?
No, we don't know. We do know, and I certainly don't know. Al-Qaeda is much weaker than it once was, and that's a good thing. I think what we have to worry about is less Al-Qaeda, whatever that is, and we need to worry about more about ISIS, which is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. So what is the relationship between ISIS and the Taliban? It's not very good. From all that I read, the Taliban are worried about ISIS. They're trying to uproot ISIS. They're trying to get rid of ISIS, and whether they will succeed in that or not. But in that sense, their attitude toward ISIS-K, is entirely different, 180 degrees different than their attitude and their actions toward Al-Qaeda when they were in control between 1996 and 2001.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. You've been a great audience. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank J. Samuel Walker for a great presentation and for answering all our many questions, which were difficult and not always easy. But thank you very much for doing so. Thank you for coming here tonight. Thanks our online audience for coming and joining us tonight. I would like to say that our next Krasno event is on October the 4th, which is a Monday exceptionally, and exceptionally at 1:30 p.m. And that is an event with a former German Foreign Minister, Sigmar Gabriel, who will join us online from Berlin, 7:30 p.m. in Berlin, but 1:30 p.m. here in the United States. And he will talk about the German elections, which will take place in late September, and about German foreign policy, because Germany's foreign policy is probably even more confused than America's foreign policy. And that is saying something, isn't it?
And he will enlighten us what the future course and what the past accomplishments, if there were any, of German foreign policy were, particularly when he was foreign minister, of course, but also what the future in Germany's role in the world, in the European role in the world, and of course, regarding transatlantic relations and that important relationship with the United States, what that will be like in the future, and the impact of Afghanistan and the withdrawal from Afghanistan will feature. You know, there has been a deep impact on the withdrawal from Afghanistan on transatlantic relations, which really have plummeted, haven't been very good at all in the recent past. But he will enlighten us. And I would like to invite all of you to join us on the 4th of October, both, of course, the in-person audience, though it will be an online event only on the 4th of October. And I would like our online audience, our Zoom audience, please to come back on the 4th of October. And let me thank you again for coming tonight, and thank Sam Walker for joining us tonight in particular.
And thank you very much. Thank you. Been a great audience, and this has been great fun for me.
Thank you.